I attended a screening very recently of Rossellini's Germany Year Zero, one of Rossellini's earlier films and one of his most acclaimed. I used to think of Germany Year Zero as my favourite of the thematic war trilogy, the other two being Rome Open City and Paisan, and I likely still would. A brilliant, cold, cinematographic aesthetic, a movie which is convicted in its unprejudiced humanism, and yet has no interest in shying away from the pathologies which emerged among the people and then poisoned them. An act of cinematic neorealism, but also a work of symbolic metaphors and dramatic ambition, the latter components are more seamlessly weaved in than they might in a more baroque or otherwise Hollywood rendition of the script. I tend to think of Rossellini as an insurmountable genius of the form. He composed major films in the 40s, as everyone readily agrees, but I think his films of the 50s were exemplary. Flowers of St. Francis, Stromboli, The Machine That Kills Bad People, Europe of 51, Joan at the Stake, Fear, Journey to Italy, India, Matrubhumi, and General Della Rovere. He was close to being the best filmmaker of that whole decade. And then in the 60s, Escape by Night, Garibaldi, Rise of Louis XIV, and Acts of the Apostles are works of varying degrees of superlative status, and then an underrated, it would seem, period of the 70s composing these magnificent biographical epics of canonical philosophers and religious thinkers, Socrates, Augustine of Hippo, Blaise Pascal, The Age of the Medici, Year One, Descartes, and the ambitious underseen The Messiah. Rossellini was one of the great directors of world cinema, and he is perhaps too often, at the surface, seen as an initial great of the Italian nation as far as auteurs were concerned, prior to the major works of Fellini, Visconti, Antonioni, Pasolini, or the more contemporary peer of his, though Visconti wholly was too, De Sica. People like Mario Bava or Sergio Leone are more widely loved than the Rossellini now, and whilst I revere all of the other Italian filmmakers I've just mentioned, Rossellini released quite consistently classic films from the early 40s. His free features prior to Rome Open City are very much worth seeing, until the mid 1970s, and he isn't often enough celebrated for this, at least from my own perception. I'm a great admirer of this particular film and Rossellini's work as a whole. Really, the set of major Italian filmmakers of the near-realist, then art house or postmodern bend, and then a couple of the champion spaghetti western auteurs or horror/slash giallo geniuses, were among the very finest contributors to the medium throughout the 20th century, often the non-English language nations most championed for their cinematic output tends to be France, obviously, but also Germany, Japan, Poland, Hungary, South Korea, and in more recent decades, China. Well, actually, the South Korea, that's an even more recent phenomenon than Chinese cinema, although China during the era under Mao was not a bastion of cinematic genius, whereas Korea has some unsung, very brilliant auteurs from the mid 20th century on, like Shin Sang-ok, and Im Kwon-taek, for instance, whose work I really need to discuss. Well, no, Sang-ok we did Thousand Year Fox, and Pulgasari, which is what's most well known for, which is a major tragedy, yeah, unfortunately. Anyway, Italy has been somewhat forgotten about, and the quality of more contemporary Italian auteurs can be discussed. The prospective successors of the old auteurs may be too conscious of being loyal successors, although when assessing the scale of the auteurs of the 20th century, Italy's place in the short list of most prominent cinematic nations must be assured. I highly recommend everyone checking this out, although it does not put one in a good mood beyond sheer admiration of the craft and how consummate and overwhelming the cinema medium or human art generally could be.